sponsored by Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society. Glad to have all you join. My name is Amir Shabar. I am the chair of the Toronto Centre of CMOS. This webinar is organized in partnership with the Ottawa Centre of CMOS. Barry Goodison is the chair of the Ottawa Centre. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, Barry Goodison would like to say a few words. Barry?
Thanks very much, Amir. I wanted to, many of you may know already, the annual Congress of the Canadian Met and Oceanographic Society was to have occurred in Ottawa this year, but a little event known as COVID disrupted that. And so it didn't occur. And we had planned at that Congress to have David give this talk as a public talk that would have been given in the evening and open to everyone. So we're really pleased that we've been able to partner with Toronto on this and have David do an even bigger talk probably than if it had been just in Ottawa. So we're really pleased about that. On a personal note, I want to say, Dave, how great you're looking and how young you are. You have the energy. You just keep going like the ever-ready bunny. And I can say that because actually David and I go back over 50 years to when we started at U of T together. So I'm really pleased to see you carrying the torch still. And we really, on behalf of Ottawa Centre, I welcome you to this evening. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Barry, very much.
Amir.
Okay, so just a few rules before I introduce the speaker. Please mute your microphone and direct all your questions on chat. So if you have any question, please put them on chat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through your questions and I'll ask David to respond. So this session will be recorded and will appear on CMOS YouTube channel in due course. So the speaker today is, as you know, David Phillips. He's a senior climatologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. David has been employed with Environment Canada Weather Service for 50 years. Can you believe it? Very long time. His work activities relate to the study of climate of Canada and to promote awareness and understanding of meteorology. He has published several books, papers, and reports, including a book on the climates of Canada and two bestsellers, The Day Niagara Falls Ran Dry and Blame It on the Weather. He is the originator and author of the Canadian Weather Trivia Calendar. David frequently appears on national radio and television as a commentator on weather and climate matters. He has been awarded the commemorative medal for the 125th anniversary of the Confederation of Canada, the Queen Elizabeth Golden and Diamond Jubilee medals, and has twice received the Public Service Merit Award. David is the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates from the universities of Waterloo and Windsor and Nipissing University. In 2011, David was named to the Order of Canada. So the topic of this evening is weather and climate, not what your grandparents knew. David?
Well, Amir, thank you so much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you to your colleagues in Toronto, Joan and Maria, for organizing this this particular event, and for my good friends and former colleagues in Ottawa, Barry and Denny and Bob. Thank you so much for inviting me aboard, and a particular thank you to Gordon Griffith, who's executive director of CMOS, for allowing this to happen and looking after all of the technical aspects of it. You know, it is a great opportunity to have a chance to speak to you from my dining room in Barrie, Ontario. The snow is flying out my window, although I think Friday it'll melt when we get to double-digit temperatures, so I'm not too worried about that. So I'm really here to talk to you about Canadians' favorite topic of conversation. Something we talk about to the point of boring and exhausting others. No, I've finished talking about Donald Trump, it's going to be the weather that I'm talking about tonight. Our love-hate relationship with the weather. You know, I often boast that we live in one of the healthiest and safest climates in the world. I mean, there are more Canadians die falling out of bed than die from weather. But it doesn't mean that we have a gentle climate in this country. The very size, the very geography of Canada indicates that we'll have our share of extreme and killer weather. You know, in an average year in Canada, we are the flashpoint between cold air to the north and warm air to the south. And what is weather? It's when warm air dukes it out with cold air. And so just in an average boring year in Canada, we get on average about 2 or 3 tropical storms that enter Canadian waters. We are the second most tornado prone country in the world, get 60 to 80. I think we get a lot more than that. It's just not enough Canadians around to document them. And 3 million lightning hits and temperatures that vary from plus 40 to minus 50. Now, projections have it by the middle of this century that Canada will inherit the climate of 600 kilometers to the south. So Toronto could be like Nashville, and Ottawa like Pittsburgh, and Winnipeg sort of like Omaha, and Calgary like Denver. And that's important because the United States gets more severe weather than any other country on planet Earth. So no place is going to look the same 40 years from now as it does now. And every Canadian is going to be affected. Nobody's going to be left out in the cold. I mean, it doesn't matter. I think some people will suffer more. I mean, the infants, refugees, poor, unemployed, the infirmed, sick, of course, will be hurt more by the vagaries of the climate ahead. And actually, we don't really have to worry about it. I mean, or not worry about it, but to wait for it. I mean, it's already occurring. Our climate is changing faster than we can cope and adapt to it. And believe it or not, these are probably the good old days, because we know the temperatures are baked into the atmosphere. It's likely that we're going to get more severe weather than we've ever seen before. So as they say, stay tuned. It's going to get even more interesting. Now, you can tell I've been around a long time. I mean, just look at me. I can remember my very first media interview. And this was in the 1970s, a decade that was considered to be one of the snowiest and coldest decades. We were talking about nuclear winter back then. And the media wanted to know whether we should look every morning to the north just to see if that ice front was a little closer to us. So we went from the ice age cometh to now the overheated planet. And hey, I've been around for both of those. Those are things occur in eons of geological time. And hey, I can remember both of them. But perhaps not surprising, we have seen in the last 30 years a dramatic improvement in our understanding of things climate. I mean, we used to think 30, 40 years ago that it was all about hemispheric or global change. And now we recognize that it's more local. And we know that things that matter locally to us mean more to us. I mean, climate change began to hit home when it started hitting our homes. We're also see it as more of not just averages, but also extremes. We see it as a subject that used to be looked upon as centuries or eons, and now it's decades or shorter. And it's gone from something that was futuristic, I'll be safely dead before it begins to bite deep and hard, to the here and now. We used to think, well, this is going to be a worry to our grandchildren. No, it is a concern to us. And even the rate of change has changed so quickly in the last few years, even compared to recent years and not too long ago. I mean, even the name has changed. We've gone from calling it global warming and then recognizing it was more than temperatures are changing to climate change. I think if we called it atmospheric terrorism, we'd have this thing nailed to the ground. But even the solution has changed. You know, we have seen extremes. We are, in fact, being suggested that we've, cut back on fossil fuels. We've flown to Kyoto and Copenhagen and Cape Town and Paris and signed documents that really haven't gone anywhere. And so now the feeling is that maybe, hey, we accept the fact that this is occurring, to suck it up, build resiliency, weatherproof ourselves, and prepare for it. I mean, the key lessons that we've learned from Hurricane Dorian last year, from the terrible Toronto floods in 2013, the Fort McMurray fires of 2017, that we're not prepared for the climate we've got, let alone the climate we're going to get. So you see, in recent years, I think the focus has been to not from climate and its averages, but to weather and its extremes. And I think that's very important for getting people to be engaged, to think that, hey, this is something that they could see and feel, this redirection. We plan for climate, but we live in weather. And when you look out the window, you can't see the climate. You can't see the enemy. I sometimes think if you can see the enemy, you have a better chance of maybe being engaged and wanting to do something about it. I mean, even the COVID virus. I mean, they've taken that microscopic picture and they show it to you. It scares you skinny. I mean, you absolutely think that it's a wanted poster. You get wanting to do something about it. But climate doesn't have that thought. I mean, it's what is climate? Climate is the statistics of weather. Climate is seen as as distant, exotic, or statistical, or academic. It's irrelevant to my daily life. It's weather that's real, that's experiential, that we're more hardwired to weather than we are to climate. So I think if we suggest that in fact, when you change the climate, you change the weather. And I think that's a very important point for people to be more engaged and wanting perhaps maybe to do something about it. Now, what is up with the weather? I mean, in recent years, we have seen the vast majority of Canadians think that the we're being cursed and clobbered a lot harder and more often in recent years. It's almost the stuff of Hollywood catastrophes, hailers, deluges, super typhoons, weather bombs. It's almost biblical scriptures type of thing. Some of the most destructive and disruptive weather in the history of our country. Canadians used to think that we were somehow immune from this. These things occurred on the other side of the world to a society different than ours. We thought every 100 years or 100-year storms occurred every 100 years, to say. It was almost as if it wasn't as if the weather was more predictable in the past, but it was almost more foreseeable. It was sort of like this envelope of or dome of familiarity, and everything occurred within that. Summers were hot and winters were cold. 100-year storms occurred every 100 years. It was that range of natural variability that we seemed to get a sense of what was coming, what was strange, and what was extreme. But now what we're seeing is these things are going outside of our realm of familiarity. These are things we've never seen before, that we don't have the tools in our toolbox to perhaps handle them, you say. So, and at the same time, our infrastructure is not equipped to handle these kinds of things. We're seeing our roads and bridges are crumbling. Sinkholes are appearing in our highways. Our pipes are leaking and cracking. And I can guarantee you right now, there are probably 600 communities in Canada that have boil water advisories. Now, for me, that sort of defining moment when I look back over my career of 50 years or so, and I say, when was the moment that I felt there was something different? And I think it was 25 years ago with the Saguenay flood, our first billion-dollar weather-related disaster. More water fell on the Saguenay that weekend than would flow over Niagara Falls in 2 months. And then came the ice storm from hell, from Kingston to the Bay of Fundy. We brought more wire and cable than would stretch around the world 3 times. I was probably the busiest of my career on that particular occasion, because I was asked to respond to media requests from around the world, not in Canada, but from around the world. And the 2 questions most asked of me, well, what's the big deal? Montreal and Ottawa have never looked more beautiful. Of course, that freezing rain can sometimes do that. Underneath that glaze, there's a lot of misery. And what could possibly bring Canadians to their knees? I mean, we're known as the winter weather people. If we couldn't handle it, then clearly nobody could. I was probably the 2nd busiest of my career that same year, and the late of that year when Environment Canada launched a research balloon west of Saskatoon. And it was to measure the rarefied gases, the ozone layer and in the stratosphere, the upper atmosphere. And then sort of something embarrassingly happened at the end. When we went to jettison the balloon from the instrument package, the balloon took off. And it drifted right across the country, and the media were phoning and wanted to know, where is the balloon today? I almost felt that people were cheering for the balloon. It was like the big balloon that couldn't. And it went across the North Atlantic. It scrambled transatlantic flying for a day or 2. We called out NATO's top guns and they filled it full of bullet holes, but the balloon kept on trekking. Came down in Finland, took us 6 weeks to get it out of customs, but we brought it back to Toronto and gave it kind of a hero's welcome. We called it the Viagra balloon. We got it up, but we couldn't get it down. But hey, so, I think that what is important here is the fact that what we have seen is that nobody has been left out in the cold in Canada. No one's immune to this. It doesn't matter whether it's province or territories or urban or rural or north and south. We've seen, for example, on the prairies, we've seen winter wildfires. We've had summer snows. We've had wild windstorms, plow winds, straight line winds, microbursts, mega bursts. We've had some of the most expensive windstorms, some of the most expensive hailstorms in all of Canada. We have seen multi-billion-dollar floods, and that's just the weather report for Calgary. In Ontario, we've had our share of extremes and strange weather too. Many of the extremes that we've seen in recent years would have been unimaginable as when I was a child, for example. At one of the most significant events, earlier this month, we had this November heat wave in eastern Canada. It was almost as if temperatures approaching Remembrance Day were like what you expect in Labor Day. But back in 2012, there was that famous meteorological mildness episode in March. In the last day of winter and the first day of spring, temperatures just rocketed up in eastern Canada. It was warmer in Kapuskasing than it was in Corpus Christi, Texas. In Fort Francis, where in the last day of winter, it's really permafrost there or close to it. Well, the lowest temperature was 15 degrees, which was 5 degrees warmer than the record for the maximum temperature on that day. In fact, the warmest temperature ever in Ontario, even just today in March, is in Petawawa, where the temperature that time in 2012 got up to 29 degrees. There were places on the last day of winter in Eastern Canada that didn't get warmer even in the summertime of that year. And of course, it was, people were beaching, there were golf courses were filled, the garden centers were packed. Of course, it wasn't all good news. The maple sector just absolutely stopped. I mean, the taste of maple syrup was just awful at that time. You had an explosion of pollen from everything from grasses to trees that were pollinating, and then of course farmers knew it. They knew this was the death knell. You had for $100 million losses to the apple industry because they blossomed out, and then the frost at the end of March and April, throughout April, came, and it was a bankruptcy for many of those people. In Toronto, a famous flooding event occurred in 2013. Not even a weather warning was out for this one. A couple of weather systems came into the city at 4:30 in the afternoon. They stalled, exploded, dumped 126 millimeters of rain at Pearson, 100 downtown, 3 millimeters at Oakville, 4 millimeters in Oshawa. It was the most targeted rainstorm I'd ever seen in an urban area. I mean, rain fell in 2 hours there, then fell in Hurricane Hazel in Toronto for a full day in 1954. It was indeed the most expensive disaster in Ontario's history in just a couple of hours. Toronto has flooded many times. We remember in 2017, the Toronto Islands, the Lake Ontario was swollen. You had any kind of a zephyr wind, light wind would cause inundation on Toronto Islands. It was shuttered down for 2 months. People couldn't get to the islands to enjoy the summer period. We saw in 2018 a rainstorm developed near York University, came into the city, 76 millimeters of rain downtown. You had the Rogers Center, Eaton Center flooded. You had probably made famous by 2 people trapped in an elevator because they couldn't get out and rescued by the Toronto police. And then even this past summer, we had in the West End during a tornado warning in the city of Toronto, we had a heavy rainfall that caused a lot of flooding. Somebody once said, recently an expert said that, in the last 15 years, Toronto's had 3 100-year storms and 6 50-year storms. And in Ottawa too, they've had their share of misery, hardship, and more from flooding and tornadoes. I remember there was a tropical storm, Francis, in September of 2004, dumped 135 millimeters of rain on that September day in Ottawa. It was the wettest September on record. If it hadn't rained that day, it would have been the driest. In other words, there had been no precipitation that whole month of September. And we've seen in the last 2 of the last 3 years, 2017, 2019, flooding in the springtime that is unprecedented. Never seen it before, just too much snow that stayed, ground frozen, heavy, wettest spring on record. And then you had winter going from slush to sweat, and you had these $250 million losses in both years from these terrible floods. And then in the last day of summer in 2018, you had, these are the floods in Ottawa, you had the tornado on the last day of summer. There were more tornadoes in Ottawa that day than occurred in all of Ontario and Quebec that whole summer. I mean, they all just waited for the last day. And of course, these were the most powerful tornadoes in Canada in September in 120 years. Now, be sure, I'm no way am I connecting these extremes of weather that I've just gone through with climate change. I mean, they may be consistent with what we might see in a warmer world, but clearly, collectively, they probably represent something that our grandparents would just never have seen in terms of the frequency, the intensity, and the impactfulness of these kind of events. Now, what can we conclude from these kind of extremes and costly disasters? Well, I think that weather disasters are clearly a growth sector globally and in Canada. And Canada's becoming a more dangerous place to live because of the kinds of extremes that we're seeing. We're breaking records at a phenomenal rate. We're breaking records. I mean, I like breaking records. I'm a climatologist, but I used to get excited about breaking a record by 1/10 of a degree or 1/2 a millimeter. Now it is just absolutely several degrees and several millimeters different than the previous record, which might have been in over 100 years of record. The costs have skyrocketed. And just ask your insurance agent. Don't take my word for it. I mean, the insurance industry are seeing these, they're paying out more for weather and water in the last 20 years than they paid out for fires and the reason they got going in the first place. And there are a couple of non-climate factors that are at play here. I mean, first of all, our greater wealth. We insure everything. I mean, this is why you see extremes in other parts of the world make headlines.
What happened? The screen is frozen.
Stand by, everybody. We'll figure this one out.
The screen was frozen and you left, I think.
Yeah.
Wow, wow, sorry about that. My gosh. I continue, do I? Amir?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, sorry for that. Maybe that storm out there has caused me some problems after all. Well, so I was saying that that what we have seen with regards to these extremes is that, I mean, we're breaking records, our costs are going off the wall, governments are beginning to worry about them. Governments used to treat weather extremes like snow removal budgets. Sometimes you'd win, sometimes you'd lose, but they can't afford that. What they're doing now is that they're looking at extremes because they're affecting our cost of living, our balance of payments, our economic indicators. And so this is of concern. We're also seeing that companies are being more engaged with regards to climate extremes. I mean, they used to look at climate changes as a suspicion in the 1990s, and now chief executive officers are being asked by their stakeholders and shareholders, not do you believe in climate change, but exactly what are you doing about it? So what is behind all of this extreme and weird and wild and wacky weather? Well, I think it's important to get a couple of things true, a couple of things that we understand. First of all, we're not seeing any new weather. I mean, it's not as if, I think it would be so much easier if we had typhoons in Saskatoon and sandstorms in Montreal. I mean, then the world would be so upside down, people would perhaps believe that something was different. But it's not really any different weather. What's different are the statistics of the weather have changed. That's really what has made the weather and climate different from what our parents and grandparents were dealing with. And what is climate? Climate is the statistics of weather. And indeed, what we're seeing is that we're seeing storms are larger, they're more widespread, they're more frequent, they're out of season, out of place. They've slowed down. I always think the best thing about Canadian weather is that it hits and runs. It doesn't stand around and torment you like it does in other parts of the world. But it's raining on Thursday, and now it's still raining on Saturday from the same storm. So we're seeing this slowdown. The other thing is that we're not just seeing sort of one epic catastrophe, but a relentless grind of overlapping, never-ending disasters. I've seen people who've been flooded out. As soon as they get their family room back in order, they're bailing and bagging and being flooded again. And we're not seeing any kind of, what we say, single weather events. You see, it's the combination of a multitude of various events that are occurring. For example, it's not just Atlantic storms, it's the fact these same Atlantic storms, maybe they're a little higher, but even if they're the same, well, the water levels are higher. So they're coming in and flooding more areas. In the forested areas, you have the forest fires. They're burning all of the trees and the underbrush, leaving you with an empty landscape, just bald. When it rains, you have landslides and floods. and then the vegetation comes back and grows, and then it dries out and hit by lightning, and you have more forest fires again. So this is the sort of the pattern, not just one event, it's a multitude of events that are occurring together. And, these past nuisance events are becoming catastrophic because, if you increase the intensity by just a little bit, well, the impacts, the damage are far greater. Insurers tell us, for example, you increase the wind speed by 10%, you cost you another 60% more in the damages because of those events. So I think it's an important point to realize. It's also important to realize, to understand that climate change doesn't create weather. It doesn't create heat waves. It doesn't create wildfires. I mean, storms happen on this planet because we have them on this planet. I mean, they've been here ever since before humankind ever arrived on this planet. And climate change, really what it does, it sets the stage. It sets the scene. It sort of makes weather kind of worse than, or more potentially impactful than it was in the past. It's sort of like, I like the baseball analogy that people use. Climate change is like steroids for weather. It's, a home run hitter, he's going to hit a number of home runs and you pay him to do that. He's going to hit them in the stands. You feed him drugs and steroids, well, he's going to hit more of them and he's going to hit them out beyond the ballpark. Well, climate change is like that. It's sort of the steroids for weather. It supercharges the weather, makes things bigger and badder and of course more extremes. But there's also something else that's important to understand. And that is, it's the weather of yesteryear and the weather of today is different in the sense that it's still important to know how much rain falls from the sky. It's always going to be important. But now we have to ask an additional question, is the surface upon which it falls. Our landscapes have been re-engineered. They, in fact, have been environmentally degraded. We're cutting down trees and not replacing them. We are taming rivers. We're reclaiming land from the sea. We're straightening rivers. We're building dams and reservoirs. I'm not against that, but I'm just saying that when you put a dam or a reservoir on a river course, you change the hydrology of that area. And it used to be 100 years ago, there were no dams in the world over 15 meters. Now there are 40,000. So no wonder the great rivers of the world are mere trickles by the time they enter the sea. The other thing we've done is we've drained the swamp. We've destroyed our wetlands. We think that wetlands are just cesspools for mosquitoes to breed in, and we replace them with condos and plowed fields. And we think that is somehow that's progress. I mean, 85% of the land of the wetlands in Ontario have disappeared. And in some areas, 93% of them have been lost. These are the way in which nature has protected us from itself, you see. And then, of course, there's urbanization. I mean, what we're seeing are these tall buildings and urban areas building up and around the world. It's the first time in human history there's more people living in cities than in rural areas right now, globally. And they say by 2040, 2/3 of the people in the world will be living in cities. And Canada sort of defies all odds. I mean, we're the lowest population density, but the most urbanized. I mean, 85% of Canadians live in communities of over 10,000 people. So by continuing to bulldoze and pave over and destroy our green infrastructure, our wetlands, our wildlands, and our woodlots, and replacing them with parking lots and strip malls and clover leaves on highways, we are really affecting and changing the water balance of our surfaces. And in most cities, I mean, cities are more than 50% of are impervious to rain. In cities like Toronto and Ottawa and Calgary, I mean, it's probably 80% of the cities are impervious to a raindrop. Doesn't matter how dry Winnipeg is or Halifax is, that raindrop becomes a flood drop. You know, we call it the Walmart effect. You know, when it rains on a grassy knoll, it takes 8 hours for the water to get down into the groundwater. but in a parking lot, it takes 8 minutes. So flooding may be an act of God, but floods and flood disasters are an act of humankind. You can't change the weather, but you can certainly change the way we can deal with weather. And even without climate change, these little hits of the past would become major blows because of who we are and where we live and what we own. Now, to be fair, hey, maybe we're just hearing more about it. There's no far off places anymore. And the more you educate people about the weather, the more weather you get. People have access to weather from their Twitter accounts, from the internet. They don't have to work at it. It's just presented to them there. And so there's more people watching the weather, commenting on the weather. And of course, the media, they love the weather. You get that atmospheric paparazzi Anderson Cooper, who stands in water to tell us not to stand in water. They know it beats Seinfeld and Simpsons in the ratings every night to bring you severe weather, extreme weather, timbers impaling cars, summer homes falling in the sea, all of these kinds of extremes. I think there's more violence on the Weather Network than any other channel. And of course, something else has changed, ladies and gentlemen, that our climate has changed. There's an overwhelming consensus that the world is warming up faster and greater now than it has in a long while. And 98% of scientists believe that the world is warming up faster. It's been warmer in the past, but certainly the speed of the change is really unprecedented. And it represents thousands of scientists from all over the world, from research institutes and universities, and thousands of governments, state and provincial and federal governments. Except one administration, the outgoing US administration, hey, they're entitled to their opinion, but not to the facts. And evidence is overwhelming from the depths of boreholes to the tip of the stratosphere that the ecosystem is warming up. The world is warming. And there doesn't seem to be any convincing alternative explanation or no compelling theory for the warming climate other than the fact that it's human activities that seem to be at play. In natural factors, if you just take a look at natural factors, they couldn't have warmed it up the way it is. If you looked at all the natural factors that cause the physical factors and controls and that you would probably find that the world would have cooled off in the last few years in a modest way rather than have runaway warming. And so what we've seen is 2019 was the 43rd consecutive year that planet Earth has been warmer than the long-term average. I mean, anybody who's younger than 35 years old has never lived on planet Earth with a colder than normal month. We have seen at the start of November was the 430th consecutive month with temperatures have been warmer than the long-term average over 135 years. It's quite convincing. And it's not just from thermometers and rain gauges. We're seeing it in oceans. The oceans and sea ice and glaciers are really taking the heat from climate change for many decades. The oceans, the top layers of the oceans have never been warmer in 2019 for probably 100 years of observations. We're seeing the oceans are less salty, more acidic as they absorb the CO2. They're turning into kind of weak carbonic acid, which is affecting ocean lives, and less oxygenated in the oceans. We're seeing global sea levels arising by by tens of centimeters, and from melting ice and glaciers, from warming water, and also geological factors such as isostatic rebound. And we're seeing the glaciers around the world are just runaway melting. I mean, in Canada, we are probably more glaciers than any other country in the world. We're seeing that the melt from glaciers in the recent years is 6 times faster than it was in the 1980s. And Canada has warmed up twice as much in half the time. The glaciers are melting, but temperature-wise, we're seeing across the country We're seeing winters are warmer, warmest season, warmer than, or warming up more than the summers. The north more than the south, more on the interior of the country rather than on the coast. So we're going through dramatic warming, but no place has warmed up more than the Arctic. The Arctic is at the top of the world, is going through, is being unraveling the climate. It's in fact becoming unhinged, warming 3 to 4 times the global average. A volume of sea ice is about a quarter of what it was in the 1980s. We're seeing the old, thick, multi-year ice, that turquoise, beautiful ice used to be 85% of ice in the Arctic, and now it's probably less than 15%. The Arctic is now becoming more water than ice. I mean, it's unthinkable. It'd be like Niagara Falls without the falls, or Algonquin Park without the trees. To think of the Arctic without ice, and yet in the lives of some of the viewers on this webinar, they will see in the summertime an ice-free Arctic sometime this clearly this century. And for northern people, it's tough. Every day they live with the effects of climate change, from building ice roads, they can't build them anymore, from building infrastructure, from hunting and fishing, from just normal living. They're being affected. It's almost a certain injustice to climate change that those people that aren't really less to do with it seem to be hit the hardest and the deepest. And so, but although in a way it's sort of like, there's a justice in the way that it's not just an Inuit thing. It's not inconceivable to think that things that are happening in the South and in Edmonton or Toronto or Montreal or Halifax could very well be because of what is happening in the North, because it is one of the basic climate controls. It's the refrigerator of the planet. It's the air conditioner of the planet. And when you change its form, then it's going to have affecting weather everywhere on the planet. And Ontario has gone through some dramatic changes, like in Ottawa. We've got a beautiful climatic record in Ottawa at the agricultural station, and over 130 years, we see temperatures have in fact actually warmed up by about 2 degrees on average. In Toronto, for example, what's so fascinating is the number of days above 30 are pretty well the same. In fact, if you go back 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, the number of hot days averaged about 15, where now in the recent years, at the end of the 20th century, they were about 13. So it's really not, global warming is not about warmer days during daytime temperatures, but it's all about warming nights, the tropical nights. It's incredible to think that the average number of nights above 20 degrees in Toronto 100 years ago averaged maybe 5 per year, where now it's more like 20 per year. The other thing that's very scary is the long durations of some of these long bouts of warm, hot nights in our large cities. We're seeing that some of them are like a week long, several episodes of a week long of temperatures above 20, these tropical temperatures. And that's what kills people. We saw the terrible deaths from European heat waves in 2003. In Montreal in 2018, 70 people died. It was because of warm nights. We're also seeing snowfall in the southern part of Canada is going down. Here we see in Ottawa, we see a 27% drop in snowfall in what is the snowiest national capital in the world. And we're seeing that. We're also seeing it in living world. I always think that human beings are the last to know about climate change. We wait for the big black cloud to hang over us before we think that we can smell or that weather is changing, or that rain is coming. Certainly for the first boil sugar off dates, 80% of them occurred after the first day of spring before 1980. After 1980, 80% of the sugar off dates occurred before the first day of spring. We're seeing magnolia trees growing in Sault Ste. Marie. We're seeing tulips in Parliament Hill growing 6 days earlier than they did 12 years ago. I predict that in 35 years, they'll be holding the Tulip Festival in Winterlude on the same weekend in Ottawa. We're seeing the deer tick. It used to be a problem in Rondeau Park and Long Point in Ontario on Lake Erie. Now from Manitoba to New Brunswick, we're seeing a higher incidence of Lyme disease because of the fact that deer tick is not only is it surviving, but it is thriving in our winter period. And biologists are concerned. They're seeing incredible mismatches in the ecology in Canada. Who has seen a bumblebee in the last several years? I haven't. They're just not to be seen. And pollinators are not arriving with flowers not open. And so there's a mismatch occurring there. Birds are migrating to the north and are breeding and are used to feed on insect larvae. And now what they're doing is their young are hatched, the mosquito larvae have already hatched and are not there. So food source is down. And of course, we're seeing from the ragweed season is a month longer than it was 20 years ago, according to the Canadian Public Health Association agency. And farmers, I mean, they are saying that they're growing crops that they could only dream of before. I mean, soybeans in the clay belt, grapes along the north shore of Lake Ontario. Who would have thunk that? But driven by markets and allowed by climate. Now, there are other examples of a nature of warming up. I mean, I just don't have enough time to show you. I suggest you look tomorrow morning into your neighbor's backyard and you will see ample proof that we are living through normal times. Now, why should we worry about this? I mean, hey, Canada, we are the second coldest country in the world. We are the snowiest country in the world. You know, I go to Winnipeg and I talk to Winnipeggers and I say, hey, you know, your winters are going to be 5 degrees warmer. That's bad news. No, they said, could you make it 10 degrees? I mean, you know, we probably could warm it up and not suffer too much. The cost benefit analysis for the next 10 or 15 years might be to our advantage. But after that, it certainly becomes problematic. Because you see, it's not about slushier winters and earlier springs. It's about greater extremes of weather. I mean, it's not complicated, ladies and gentlemen. When you warm up the world, atmosphere by 1 degree can hold 7 to 12% more moisture. So you're going to get a heavier dose of rain when it chooses to rain. And these are not just one-offs. This is not just bad luck. This is not a trend, a fluctuation. It's a trend. We're seeing weather extremes are easier to create. They're not about to go away. The other thing that's important to realize is not just extremes, but we're also seeing more variable conditions. And that's, you know, farmers understand what variation means. The public maybe is not as familiar with that terminology, but it's sort of the swings, it's the wild, it's the jokers in the weather deck, it's the weather 180. It's like you go from one extreme to the other. Instead of having 50 years of farming, you might have a wet season, a wet year then, and then 20 years later, a dry. What farmers are telling me, they are seeing they could have bought flood insurance and drought insurance in the same growing season. They're seeing that things are in fact such variable. What doesn't occur anymore is normal weather. And you know, that's important because we base everything on normal weather. We plan strategies and policies and decisions and plans based on normal weather. But if it's not normal anymore, then in fact, it becomes much more difficult to deal with. There's more surprises. Now, let me give you a forecast. I always bring a forecast in my hip pocket. And I forecast for what it'll be like in, say, 50 years from now. But very simply, in Ontario, for example, many parts of southern Canada, warmer, wetter, wilder. That's my forecast, warmer. Take the warmest period you ever remember. Maybe the warmest summer. The past summer was warm in eastern Canada. Maybe it was 1988, another warm summer. Well, that in 50 years will be the coldest. So what we're going to see in the next 20 years, we've probably seen in the past 70 years. And it means for Ottawa, for example, it means that, you're still going to have cold temperatures, but instead of 60 all day, all freeze days, there might be 20. So it may be not skating on the Rideau Canal. It may be white Christmases are like Vancouver, 10% of a chance of a white Christmas, not 80. It could be backyard skating rinks, could be not possible. And in terms of wetter, we're going to have wetter problems, more acute and chronic water problems, too much water sometimes, too little water most of the time. The Great Lakes may not be as great. We will see less snow, more precipitation, but not enough to match the increases of temperature that we see in the coming up. So we'll have aquifers will be more depleted, wells will go drier because, more precipitation, but higher temperatures that will be more evaporation and more demand for that water. And wilder weather. I mean, clearly. We don't know exactly where and when and why, but we know that the conditions that produce warmer weather or more extreme weather will be more prevalent. So the storms that are hitting us now and going forward are going to be bigger and badder and more impactful in the years to come. I mean, future superstorms will just be that much more super in the years to come. And with the warming baked into the atmosphere, it's almost a guarantee. We're almost committed to see more of these extremes in the years to come. I mean, hurricanes, there's a lot of controversy as to climate change and hurricanes, but certainly there's the feeling that hurricanes, they may be fewer, but they may be more major ones, but they'll be slower, and water temperatures will be warmer. And so they could be very slower. And I think that is the risk for Canada. I used to like to think that hurricanes, storms hit and run, but they may very well take their sweet time in coming through Canadian waters. And I think that will be an issue. Don't think that we'll be Miami of the North and the East. I mean, the fact that when you're -8 for a temperature and you all of a sudden become -2, well, you're going to be closer to that sweet zone of whether you get rain, snow, or freezing rain. So, on first crack, it doesn't seem so bad, maybe. There's going to be some advantages. I mean, warmer temperatures, shorter winters, maybe less money on putting out sand and salt on highways. Summers will be warmer. Gardeners will be happy. They'll be able to grow exotic plants they could only dream of. Maybe some of the familiar and likable plants will not be possible, but hey, there are some advantages there. But it's going to be winners and losers. There are going to be serious consequences with the extra one. I think from a health point of view, the quadrupling of the hot days and hot nights, a very serious issue. Some areas may become inhabitable around the world because of the very hot temperatures. We're going to see droughts. Droughts will not just be one-offs. We might see back-to-back droughts or megadroughts or decadal-long droughts, you say. And that will be, I think, an issue, particularly on the prairies and concern. From diseases, from Lyme disease and West Nile virus and weeds and insects they'll love the kind of conditions. And so we'll have to deal with new creatures to look after. So I think, what is the issue of climate change? Well, I think it has to be taken seriously. I mean, many of you have thought of climate change. You probably don't have any long-term plans about it, but certainly preaching about climate change and putting signatures on documents to do something about it is not going to make a difference. I mean, the cost of doing something is often less than the cost of doing nothing, I think. I mean, we sometimes fear the solutions more than the impacts from climate change. I think the people I talk to and surveys I see across Canada, the Canadians are engaged with climate change. They feel that the climate seems different now than when they were youngsters. Perhaps they feel that it's a big problem that they can't solve. Perhaps they feel that there's time to correct it, to just give us time and we'll straighten it all out. It's not an in-your-face kind of issue. It's not a top of mind. It's not a people aren't dying from the big melt. It's like a tremor, not an earthquake, you say. And we don't have that historical and psychological connection to climate change like other things. You know, we can clean up an oil spill, we can solve terrorism in places, we can deal with trade issues and inflation and what have you. But climate is kind of a new thing. You know, there's not the tools in the toolbox to handle it, you say. And humans think also, well, we can innovate our way out of it. You got a problem, you can throw science and technology or engineering at it, and we can solve it. Well, that may be possible, but it's a bit of a risk. It's not a sure thing that it's going to happen. We're also, I think, we suffer a bit of fatigue about climate change. It's been around a long time. We're hearing about the doom and gloom, the apocalyptic end of the world, and 2056. If you scare the pants off people, they freeze. They're going to not do much about it. It's that we want to give hope, I think, to people, that not the sermon of hopelessness and the shock and awe of terrifying catastrophic disasters. I think we want to, all that negative hype engenders indifference and inaction. We want to give people hope that they can do something about it. So what do we do about it? Well, I think we certainly need to think about cutting back on fossil fuels. I mean, we've had 25 years of missed goals and broken promises, and try to decarbonize, do as much as we can. I mean, it's not going to be, I think it's going to not save the world. It might buy us a little bit more time. I haven't seen any evidence that we're headed that way. Even during the pandemic, we had more CO2 in the atmosphere after the in spring and summer of this year than, and it's continuing. It's going to be millennial before we can remove that CO2 in the atmosphere. So, hey, by slowing it down, by not just trading it and burying it, but doing more with less, so we can maybe buy a little bit of time. But I'm not hopeful. I think the International Energy Agency says that by 2040, that 3/4 of the world's fuel will still be fossil fuels, and so we can hope to slow it down and buy a little bit more time, perhaps. I think what we need to do is to put as much effort in mitigation, or put as much effort as we have in mitigation, in adapting, and in fact, doing something about it. Trying to a better plan would be to reduce the risks before they happen. You're not going to stop the rains, but you can reduce the risk from flooding by properly preparing for it and responding. I mean, we have a choice, I think. We can cross our fingers and hope that 100-year storm that occurred last year won't come back for 99 more years. Or we can just say it's the cost of doing business. You bail in your bag and you bury the dead and you get back to normal and you wait for another storm, another spring flooding the next year. Our preference has always been, we spend billions of dollars in cleaning up rather than in spending millions of dollars in preventing the loss in the first place. I think everybody has to be involved. I think this is a team sport here. It's not just, it's not just, you can't expect the federal government to bail you out every time Mother Nature misbehaves. It's individuals, it's small municipalities, it's condo corporations, it's neighborhoods, it's small cities that need to work together to try and make things different and not just to think, well, I've talked to mayors and councillors and they say, well, we were hit once, we won't be hit again. Well, it's not as if lightning does strike twice in the same place. It's almost as if what we need to realize that this is not just something that occurs in Bangladesh or Botswana or Bolivia, but in Burlington and Bowmanville too, that we have our share of these hits, so we need to prepare for them. And I think for municipalities I talk to, they think, well, it's a matter of building domes and seawalls. No, I mean, it's not that. Sometimes it's very inexpensive items that are required, and they have the tools to do it. They have the tax incentives, they have zoning bylaws and buying up property and land use planning to be able to make communities safer, to weatherproof communities from the extremes of climate that we see. And simply, we don't have, just you can make decisions that just not letting people build in the floodplain or to take them out of risk areas, to say, buy up vulnerable properties and move people out. Build Back Better, something that President-elect Biden loves that logo and those words, and it's something that we clearly need to do and allow people to build back after they've been hit, something stronger to withstand the kind of changes in climate that we've seen. So I think we need to clearly do things differently in a planning point of view. I think looking at nature-based solutions is I think makes sense. It's just let nature protect us from itself and restore that green infrastructure whenever possible. I think makes a lot of sense. So Mayor, let me just say some final words to wrap up. I think it's important to realize that I think climate change is the defining challenge of our times. I think it's real. I think it's serious. It's not a conspiracy, not fake news. It's not a fantasy. It's hypothetical. It's not just about skinny polar bears. It's about human beings and people. And at no time, I think, in the last, say, 30 years, where science has been trying to grapple with this issue, there's no way has scientists wavered from their predictions of what we're going to see. I mean, there's been some fine tuning and there's been some added details, but climate is behaving, and I know because I was there, as the researchers predicted it would back in the 70s and 80s when this became more of a serious issue, and things have come true. I mean, but the only thing I suppose we could say that they maybe underestimated some of the effects, such as rising sea levels. No one saw the glaciers and the ice caps melting as quickly as they have. I think the science is solid and strong and robust. Yes, there's uncertainty, there always is. But just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we should ignore what we do know about it. Whether it's going to be 3.5 degrees warming or 2.8, who cares? I mean, it's still going to be a threat and a harm having to deal with those kinds of situation. I've lost track of my slides. I'll wind it up with these last two. So I think our motivation for doing something about climate change is based not on what we have seen, but what we are about to see in the years ahead. I think it'll be clear because of that baked in temperatures. We're committed to clearly warmer times and more volatile and chaotic kind of weather. This is, I think, not a fight against climate change. Rather, I think it is showing us how we can live better with the weather we've got and the climate we're going to get. But thank you very much. I apologize for that terrible interruption, but thank you for those that stayed aboard.
Thank you very much, David. That was very informative and entertaining slides that we saw. I'm looking at the chat window, and I only see one question there. And someone is asking about, it says, talking about grandparents, to what extent are the Farmer's Almanac weather forecasts verified or not by case records?
Well, it doesn't matter what group I talk to, I always get a question on the Farmer's Almanac, and it's one that they've been around for 200 plus years, so they've got a lot of experience in doing it. I think in terms of Environment Canada, I think we've been doing it for maybe 25 years, all these long seasonal outlooks. So Amir, what was the question was, who
It's
are
about
the
clarification of the
verification? Okay. Well, you know, I remember reading once a verification, somebody was testing the accuracy of the Farmer's Almanac, its claims. This was in the Weatherwise magazine back in the, I think it was the 1960s or 70s. And of course, they found that it was no better than flipping a coin. And of course, very different from what the editors of the Farmer's Almanac claim that they are. And I have no problem with them issuing their forecasts every year. That's fine. I normally take a look at them to see them. But the fact that they claim they're 80% right is really just hogwash, because they're doing the scoring, and so I think it's a bit rich to suggest that the forecasts are. In fact, well, last year, let me just give an example. They said it was going to be the winter from hell. It was going to be the winter of our youth. It turned out to be the 7th warmest in 73 years. So, but nobody took them to task on it. So it is, but hey, they live on because people buy their copies, and I love the weather wisdom in the Farmer's Almanac, but I don't believe for one moment the accuracy. And of course, the other thing, if you don't like the pronouncements of the Farmer's Almanac, well, then go to the Old Farmer's Almanac, or the Country Rural Guide, or the Harrowsmith Guide, and you're sure to find the forecast that you like there. The other thing I remember I don't like about in this year's forecast, they said that, well, the second week of January and the second week of February will look out. It's going to be a really blustery and a lot, especially in Ontario, and very a very difficult time with record amounts of snow. Well, I mean, of course, their forecast was issued more than a year and a half ago to keep up with the publication dates. So the law of averages say they could be right, but my sense is more likely I wouldn't be betting the family farm or the fishing fleet on their forecast.
Okay, we also received a bunch of questions by email just prior to your talk. And one of the questions relates to the wind. And in particular, it says, is climate having an effect on winds in Ontario and in Canada? It seems like windier now than what it was many years ago, decades ago.
I certainly think, Amir, the last year there have been, I know when I have do radio interviews on the prairies, they're always very quick to point out how windy it has been. I mean, it's very episodical. It depends upon that particular month, that particular period, and we certainly know there can be some windy moments. But whether the winds are increased more over the years compared to other times, I haven't seen any reports on. I know that I've seen reports on wave heights and winds in the North Atlantic, and they are higher. They are higher there than in the period of record that they looked at. But my sense is there's been so much emphasis on temperature and precipitation, and winds have just not been addressed as much as some of the other elements of in climate.
Okay, one more question, and this is related to the wind. This is from Tober Murray. A question about the lake level, in particular Lake Huron. It says, when do they peak and when do they start to recede? And how do we measure that?
Is this the winds or the water levels?
Water level.
Water levels. Well, what we've seen certainly in the last year, this particular year, 2020, we have seen record water levels on all the lakes, I think, except Ontario and maybe Superior. Ontario has been very high, but certainly Erie, Huron, Georgian Bay, and Michigan, even Lake St. Clair, the water levels have been have record high, and these are records that go back almost more than 102 years of records. And never has there been higher water levels that we've seen, particularly in the springtime. I think when you look at it from the year, they typically are the lowest at this time, typically in the fall, and then they begin to rise up as the next year, you go into the next year and beyond. But certainly we saw record levels, and every time that the wind blew, there was some shoreline erosion and inundation from shoreline and from higher water levels, and clearly this was an impact that mariners had in harbors and what have you. I mean, people like to have stabilized water levels, and we have seen them certainly in the last couple of years to be quite high. It wasn't too long ago, though, Amir, that I remember, I think it was maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that we had record low levels. And, you know, for so much of my life in the Great Lakes area, it's been one of, 20 years of low levels and then 20 years of high levels. And what we're seeing, though, in recent years is this increased variability. The fact that we can go from record high levels. I remember in January, February of I'm thinking of the year was maybe 4 years ago. And in 2 years, we had actually gone to the highest on record. And so that quick turnaround is something that is what we're seeing now. And a lot of people who are studying climate change in the Great Lakes, they feel that is really what the forecast for the future will be. On salt water, it's at higher water levels because of melting glaciers and other reasons. But in the lower lakes, in the Great Lakes, the freshwater lakes, it is this fluctuation, this variation of water levels, which becomes very difficult.
Okay, the next question is concerning the winter maintenance and the city budgets for the snow removal. It says with decreasing weather observing network, we are going into a new form of data mobile weather data from connected vehicles. I'm not familiar with this particular setup, but it says winter maintenance is a huge budget and we're losing metrics to measure snowfall amounts. I guess the question is, with the decreasing network of stations, it has an impact of snow measurement, and consequently, it will have some effect on the city maintenance budget for the snow removal.
Well, it's a sensitive point for me. I have to watch what I say about it. I truly believe that we're in the snowiest country in the world. We should be taking more snowfall measurements. And I'm often bothered when governments, both provincial and federal governments, decrease their observing network instead of enhancing it. And I think some of these volunteer stations are, I think the world of these people who go out into their backyards and stick a snow ruler in and get the amount of snow that has fallen since the last observation and recorded as part of the history of Canada. I mean, these are my heroes, and I think that. But the person asking the question is so right. We're seeing a decline in the number of traditional means of measuring snowfall. Now, of course, we measure snowfall from flood forecasting and other purposes, irrigation, using satellites and other platforms. But in terms of that kind of day-to-day and how much snow fell and certainly from road operations, it's quite critical. And there are some private weather networks that we use, private in the sense that people that don't necessarily report to Environment Canada, but to other, they have their own places that they report their observations. And it's a matter of getting a hold of these and making sure where they are. I know that some cities believe so much in the weather observations that they have their own network of stations, again, for their own use. And some of these are in public works yards in various cities. again, they have different instrumentation, different observing practices, so you can't always marry the results from one station to the other, but people do have other means of observing it rather than going to the official government sources.
Okay, another question is, it says that your message seems to give the impression that we're trying to stop or limit climate change, just adopt. Okay for us 70-year-olds, but hopefully the younger generation will be more positive.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think it's, hey, I look to my grandchildren and younger people who, you know, some of the changes I've talked about in 50 years, I mean 2/3 of the Canadians alive today will be there experiencing this kind of weather. It's going to have a profound effect, of course, on them and the way they do everything in terms of living and livelihoods and risk and everything. So I clearly think that the adaptation side is something as perhaps my training and my understanding that I feel that we've not done enough. And that is the hope. I mean, people often said, Amir, that, well, adaptation is like throwing in the towel. It's like not, you know, it's giving up on trying to cut back on the fossil fuels and greenhouse gases and things like this. Well, I think the reality is that even if we stopped we stopped all traffic today, grounded all planes, the future's still going to be warmer. From the residence time of CO2 that's measured in centuries or millennium, I mean, we're still committed to that kind of warming. That's why you can talk about what the situation will be like in 2090 with more confidence than what it'll be next week or 2 weeks from now with regards to the weather. I mean, you just know that we're headed that way. And I think that the hope then is to say, okay, it can be a warmer world. We're going to have more of these extremes and risks. Well, what we need to do is to plan for them, to weatherproof ourselves, you know, and it's not sort of throwing in the towel. I mean, it's taking advantage of the situation. People who have a sense to weatherproof your communities. And I say to people in municipalities, I say, you know, it's better. I mean, it's your property is going to be more valuable if you've done the necessary improvements. Industry is going to locate in your community. You're going to be attractive if you've in fact built a community that's more resilient to the kinds of extremes of weather and the variations of climate that we're going to clearly see as we go ahead.
Okay, the next question is concerning the global effect, how the global changes is affecting Canada. And in particular, it says that changes affecting the world, and those changes will impact Canada, from fluctuation in agriculture imports to new migration patterns. Could you comment on how we will likely be impacted by broader global changes in Canada?
Well, I've often said that, you know, the way that Toronto will feel the effects of climate change, or they'll see the effects of climate change, will be on a jumbo jet that arrives at Pearson Airport. I mean, because of the impacts that we're seeing around the world, more dramatically maybe than in Canada, or at least they're having greater impacts because of the fact that we have all these safety nets and governments to get us back to normalcy and what have you. I think people are feeling the hardship elsewhere, from not just from low-lying tropical islands that are being flooded, but even some of the security issues with regards to skirmishes and wars and refugees. They're climate refugees. That's going to be a legitimate, if it isn't already, a category of people that have been evicted from their homes and their places because of wild weather and changing conditions. And we will have to certainly look for them. I mean, look after them and help not only in their homeland but also in providing safe haven here in Canada. I think that we have some advantages in Canada. I mean, clearly agriculture, for example, of the 185 countries in the world, 5 countries are going to be superpowers with regards to agriculture, and Canada is one of them. I mean, we're going to see an expansion into frontier lands. I mean, the issue will be soils, of course, but clearly we're going to see some advantage for agriculture in some cases with the kind of changing climate that we see. And we have the land to enable people to settle. But I think that I think we're fortunate in Canada. I mean, we have always dealt the tough weather deck. I mean, who would have come to Canada? They've been the truth been known about what this country was like in terms of its climate and its winters and what have you. So we've learned how to deal with tough weather. And I think that we're going to be just challenged in the future more for that way. But I think we've got the advantage, we've got the heads up on other countries. And so I think we can improve the situation by because of who we are and how we embrace this and what we do.
Okay, one last question before we close, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic having any effect at all on speeding up or slowing down climate change?
Yeah, I mean, the only interesting thing, I think that certainly in April, there were claims around the world. You could see in India, you could see the mountains there and the air pollution in Montreal was less, air was cleaner. I mean, people were enjoying the environmental the qualities that arose because of less traffic, industry slowed down and what have you. And certainly when we look at the amount of CO2 inputted, carbon dioxide burned, it was about 17% less in April. Well, by May, it was now about 7%. So it certainly didn't take long. But I think more seriously, though, was not just the fact that, in fact, this year, the estimate is that about 5 or 7% less CO2 than would have been burned through because of the pandemic, the slowdown and what have you. But the key thing, though, is the amount of CO2 in the reservoir, in the atmospheric reservoir, is higher now. It is growing continuously. And even the pandemic didn't slow that down because it is just added, even if a little bit is added, it's that just much more to the reservoir of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I think from a science point of view, I think what for me, the pandemic has been a boost for science. I mean, it's been hard hit in some places and what people think of scientists, but I think it's going to prove that that scientists are presenting are the hard evidence, it's the fact-based, the evidence-based. I think science will come out of this as a clear winner in terms of its reputation and how people embrace science and how useful it is to provide information for people making policy decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. This concludes today's session. Please take care, stay safe, and goodbye. See you later.
Bye.